1. A few years ago, I was doing a high school project where I had to interview a figure I looked up to in my life, about a trying time in their life. Naturally, I chose a grandma-like figure in my life, Marie, who took care of me a lot when I was growing up. She was a robust 95-year-old, double amputee with red hair she would dye every Friday, though she would never dare admit it. She lived in the same town as me, alone in a small house on the edge of town after her late husband, Quinn, passed years ago. Marie had no kids or living relatives except a niece that tried to poison her. So when her friend, my mom, had her kids, she adopted me as one of her own. So when I asked her if I could interview her, she was delighted, and we scheduled to meet the next week for a few hours. When that day came, I arrived to see she had brought out pictures of her and her husband in Honduras years ago, fixating on one of them standing together in a river clearing. This is where her and our story will begin. Marie and Quinn used to live in the northern United States, where they were married and stayed happily for many years, until one day Quinn told her that they would be moving to Honduras for his job, and so they did. They moved into a large house on the outskirts of a small village with a river out back, deep in the forests of Honduras. For the majority of their time there, she stayed in the house, traveling only out with Quinn after she learned her lesson the first time. She then went into a story about how one day, out of curiosity, she went out alone to a public meeting that went on once a week, every week, that she always heard people talking about. When she got to the center of the village, she discovered to her horror that these meetings were not public gatherings for discussions, but rather public executions. She painted an image of everyone in the village gathered around a large platform, where a few unlucky souls were lined up and taken one by a large man. She described him as a hulking mass of muscles, with scars covering his body, with a massive one across his face. The stern figure would take each person one at a time, force them to their knees, then take a large rusty hatchet and fulfill his name of the Hatchet Man. After seeing this, Marie would retreat home and stay indoors for months, only leaving on special occasions, such as when she would be escorted out to a nearby large house to tell her husband something important. Upon arrival, she was taken upstairs and down a large hallway. When she entered the door at the end, she found her husband with several other men in suits that she described as Honduran officials, playing poker with a bathtub full of money in the room. Quinn scolded her for coming to find him, and she returned home. The next morning, she was sitting outside on her porch when a jaguar came down and started to drink from the river. She sat and watched it for what felt like hours. Before leaving, it looked at her and ran off. She then got the feeling that it was time to leave. Coincidentally, the next week she was woken up in her room by a family friend in the middle of the night, expressing to her that something went wrong and that she needed to get out now. The woman handed her a note from Quinn that said that a coup had broken out, and that she is not safe here anymore and must leave before sunrise. The letter continued by detailing directions to a field where a plane will be waiting to take her to a town in the southern United States, with only an address. She tried finding Quinn, but couldn't, and with only an hour before dawn, she headed to the field. When she arrived, she saw a large empty knee-high grass pasture, with a small two-person plane sitting in the middle. She approached the plane with only the guidance of a dim candle, and just when she was about to board, she felt two firm taps on her shoulder. Marie turned around to see a large figure looming behind her. The Hatchet Man. She described being immobilized with fear as a trickle ran down her leg. But before she could yell for help, the Hatchet Man said in a low voice,
No, Miss Marie, don't scream. I am here to make sure you get on this plane safe."
She got on the plane and left Honduras, never to return. She went to a small house on the edge of a small town, and would not hear from her husband for several months until one day, when he randomly arrived at her door with flowers. Marie would later develop cervical cancer and have her reproductive organs removed, keeping her and Quinn from having kids. Though this, and even an eventual double amputation, didn't stop her from having a family, befriending a woman and taking in that woman's kids as her own. She would die roughly 20 years later, leaving everything to her kids. To Marie, thank you for everything you have given me. To the Hatchet Man, if you are still out there, thank you for your service, but let's not ever meet. 2. A few years ago, I had a dog-sitting business with regular clients. One of those regular clients was a lady with a big, nice house. There was a really long driveway leading up to the house, and it was tucked far back from the residential roads. It was somehow isolated while being in a dark residential neighborhood. No one could drive to the house without being noticed. No one could park on the adjacent streets. And it would be very unusual for anyone to be walking up to the house or through the yard without having already parked in the driveway. The last time my house and dog sat there, everything began as usual. I fed the dogs, gave them their various meds, and played with them for a while watching movies. Best job ever. Eventually I got sleepy and went to bed in the master bedroom per orders. This room has huge, beautiful windows, with a view of the driveway, the only normal access point. I liked that about the room. After browsing on my phone in bed, I turned everything off and was trying to go to sleep. As I am laying there staring at the ceiling, deep in thought, I snapped to total awareness. Nothing changed. No one came up the driveway, everything was silent, and yet I suddenly started to feel very uneasy. The hair starts to stand up on the back of my neck. A voice in my head is urgently stating, "You're being watched, someone is watching you." My heart rate starts to pick up. I've never experienced anything like this, and couldn't explain it in the least. I called my boyfriend immediately, grabbed my stuff, ran to my car, locked the doors, and sped out of that driveway. I glanced around the house while I was leaving and saw nothing, and no one. When I got home, I checked every door to make sure it was locked, and slept on the couch with a view of both entry points. The paranoia slowly dissipated, and I was eventually able to sleep. The next day I returned in the morning and took care of the dogs, Loves, meds, potty, breakfast. I started walking through the house toward the back where the master bedroom is, and again started feeling really strange. Not a watched feeling this time, but a high alert sense that things were off. I began to notice that candy wrappers were out that weren't there the night before. Doors were open that I specifically closed to keep the dogs corralled. Things were moved. I left again and called my boyfriend to stay with me. I couldn't be there alone. Someone was absolutely in the house the night prior. I wondered if maybe someone in the family stopped by, but I always am given a heads up with lots of warning before someone comes over. It's not too uncommon for the owner's son to stop by, but he has my number and always gives me a heads up. I call the owner and tell her what I noticed. She tells me she'll call around to see if anyone had dropped by. She calls me back in under an hour and assures me that no one did. "It must be that old ghost," she says and giggles. What a relief that she was taking my safety concerns so serious. I tell her I'm having my boyfriend come over just to be cautious. She doesn't mind. A few hours later, me and my boyfriend get to the house. He checks the downstairs, absolutely never am I to go upstairs, and everything is just fine. We're hanging out for hours, playing with the dogs and watching movies. I left my boyfriend in the living room, walk past the door, and go to the bathroom around 10 p.m. I'm about to walk out of the bathroom and the dogs start barking. As I'm walking back, I see my boyfriend is standing in the entryway by the living room. He's focused on the front door and tense like I've never seen him. Again, the hair stands up on the back of my neck. He quickly ducks to the side of the front door window. Before I can finish asking what's going on, he tells me, "Shh,
Someone's out there."
He approaches the door and looks out, but the person was gone. I rush over to him and he explains that he was sitting on the floor in the living room when the dog started barking at the front door. My boyfriend goes over toward the door and sees a black figure peeking into the window and then walk off. When I looked out, no one was there anymore. I'm absolutely terrified, so I text the son to make sure again that it wasn't him. Short aside, a few weeks prior he asked me to go to a wedding with him and I gently replied, my boyfriend, who the son knew about, wouldn't think that was appropriate. So when I asked him if he stopped by the house, he replied, "My girlfriend doesn't think it's appropriate that you're texting me so late." I apologized and told him I had a safety concern and it was important. I told him what my boyfriend saw. He simply responded that he didn't stop by. At that point, we were done for the night. We put the dogs in their kennels, waited a little bit, and ran to my car. The next day, I very quickly took care of the dogs in the morning and left before the owner got back. I've never felt such a deep electric sense of imminent danger like I did that night in bed. That was just too much. When the owner asked me back a few months later, though I desperately needed the money, broke student, I politely declined. 3. This story is probably over 40 years old now, from when my mom was a summer camp counselor as a teenager. Every counselor present swears this tale is true. The following tale is long and consists of a few smaller events rather than one single encounter, so I've divided it into 4 main parts to make it a little easier. To give an idea of the setting, it was and still is a pretty normal summer camp, around 300 to 400 acres with 5 cabins each assigned a letter A through E. Every Sunday a new batch of campers would arrive around 3 to 4 in the afternoon, and on Saturdays they'd leave by noon. Half the summer it would have boy campers, and then the other half they'd have girls. My mom was there for 2 weeks during the girls' half. Cabins A, B, and C are on top of a hill along with a small chapel, and Cabin D, which was basically used by counselors as a meeting space, is at the bottom of the hill. It's partially built into said hill, so people could feasibly walk onto the roof from the hill, which, neat. And Cabin E, meanwhile, is located on another hill entirely. Next to it is a fire pit and seating, which takes up a good amount of space. There's a road at the bottom that is an access road my mom hesitates to call a road. One direction goes to town, and the other dead ends at another summer camp, totally unrelated to my mother's camp, about half a mile away. The properties didn't touch, it was on the other side of the road, but it was there. The creek had a couple of footbridges you could use to cross. On to the story. Part 1, the first sighting. So for the first week my mom's there. There's not many kids, so they only have senior counselors present. Most of them were in the 17 to 21 age range. My mom would have been around 17 or 18 since she was still in high school. On Thursday night, she and a few other female counselors were hanging out in Cabin D and talking, when they heard something on the roof. At first they figured it was a raccoon, but then they realized the noise was too loud. 2 of the girls decided to go outside and investigate. While they looked at the roof, 2 of the male counselors came running down the hill.
"Hey, I think we just saw a guy jump off the roof and run into the woods."
And practically the moment they said that, they heard an unexpected sound, an engine. They looked down at the access road and see a car's lights suddenly light up. Someone had parked there in the dark with the lights totally off, in a spot slightly hidden from their view due to the trees and angle of their location. On top of that, they can now see another figure running to the car and hopping into the passenger side, at which point it tore out of its spot and sped off back towards town. So to recap, there was a man stomping around the roof. This man jumped off and ran down the hill and crossed the creek to the road, where another person was waiting in a car, hidden from sight with all the lights off, and drove off. This is obviously not normal. You know how in horror movies, teens and young adults tend to joke about the obvious signs there's a monster lurking around, waiting for its target? Turns out that's actually pretty accurate. Instead of getting creeped out like a rational person, my mom and the other counselors found it more funny than anything and started joking around about it. Someone threw out the name Nerd on the Roof, and it stuck. It became a running joke among them, shortening the name to Nor. Part 2, A Night in Cabin E. Now, my mom's memory is a bit spotty about the timeline of this next particular event, but it most likely happened on Friday, the very next night. Remember how Cabin E is far away from the others? There's a vast swath of trees that also surrounds it. This cabin is so far removed from the rest of the camp. It actually had its own telephone connecting to the main part of the camp. This was during the 70s, cell phones did not exist yet. Since it was so remote, they usually assigned older campers to it. But during my mom's first week, they didn't have enough campers to need it though. So my mom and 2 other female counselors were assigned to sleep there. So on Friday, the phone rings in the middle of the night and wakes them up. One of my mom's fellow counselors answers groggily, "Hello? Okay." She then hangs up, grabs a broom, leans it against the door handle, and crawls back into bed to try to return to the sweet land of sleep. My mom and her other counselor are confused and ask what's going on. They get this sleepy response. "Fred said he thought he saw someone in the woods, and he's heading down here with a gun." Instantly, my mom and the other girl are wide awake and go into panic mode, as they recognize the potential setup for their starting scene in a real-life reenactment of the plot of Friday the 13th. Meanwhile, the girl who answered the phone just tries to go back to sleep, apparently confident the broom will foil any attempts to break into the cabin. Fortunately for them, no one came busting down the fortified door, and soon enough one of the male counselors arrived with a shotgun. He stayed over the rest of the night, since he, like my mom and counselor number 2, had some doubts about how effective a broom is at keeping out intruders. As you can probably tell, my mom now finds this particular part of the story funny due to her friend's lack of reaction and survival instinct. It helps that the night passed peacefully with no more sightings or scary events. However, the next morning they found the phone line had been cut. That is a little less funny and made them a bit more wary. But this whole night would just be more of an afterthought after the next events. Part 3, Breaking News. Cut to the next day. As I said earlier, the campers would leave on Saturday morning, giving the counselors a bit of free time until the next batch arrived on Sunday. They'd go into town on Saturday afternoon to get laundry done and pick up essentials. Now, despite having 2 summer camps, this was a small town, small enough that it only published a tabloid-sized newspaper once a week on Saturdays. This week, one of the counselors just happened to pick up a copy, and it was mostly forgotten until later that night when they were hanging out in the pavilion playing cards. In between turns, someone glanced at the police blotter and suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God!" and then began reading out loud. Remember that other camp I mentioned at the end of the access road? It was a smaller camp than theirs, and instead of cabins it placed kids in tents along with a counselor. At some point that week, there was an attempted kidnapping there. When I say attempted kidnapping, I don't mean someone tried to pick up a kid who wandered away from camp or looked like they were alone. He opened an occupied tent in the middle of the night, picked up a random kid in full view of the other campers and counselor, and just took off running into the woods while carrying this random child. That is quite possibly the most blatant attempted kidnapping I've ever heard of to date. I actually had to pause my mom here and check the kid's age, 8 or 9 for the record, because the idea of a man running into the woods while carrying a child is just so ludicrous. The counselor in the tent naturally gave chase, because one does not just sit by when a random stranger opens your tent and scoops up a child. Eventually the man had to drop the boy in order to get away, at which point the counselor stopped his pursuit to redirect his attention to the obviously traumatized child. The kidnapper was never caught. Needless to say, all of my mom's fellow counselors were freaked out by this, and also outraged that they hadn't been informed of this since this camp was literally just up the road. The same road where they saw two mysterious strangers flee just 2 nights prior. Suddenly, the Nor wasn't quite so funny anymore. Part 4. The Nor. Week 2 arrives. Mom can't remember if the phone line to Cabin E got repaired in this time or not. But they had more campers this week, so a group of older girls were assigned to it as per custom. Mom and the other counselors continue to stay there as well. There is a lake in the camp, with what my mom calls the pageant area. At the end of the week on Friday nights, they would gather the kids there for what she calls an Indian pageant. Again, this was the 70s, different time. What an Indian pageant involves I don't know, and it's irrelevant to this story. All that matters is that all the kids and most of the counselors were gathered there that night, rounding off the week with one last hurrah before they left the next day. While this went on, someone came running to the pageant grounds. My mom can't remember who it was anymore, but they grabbed her and a couple of other counselors and pulled them aside.
Someone broke into Cabin E.
Cabin E, the cabin my mom and 2 other counselors were occupying alongside a group of older girls, the isolated cabin at the exact opposite end of the camp. They took off running, and because of the distance it took 10 minutes to reach it. When they got inside, they found something out of a horror movie. Someone had gotten into the camper's belongings and tore it all up. She describes the kids' bras lining the rafters, sleeping bags and pillows all slashed up. The clothes were all cut to pieces and strewn all over. The cabin was a total mess. All of the camper's belongings were a write-off. But most chilling of all, in the mirror, someone had emptied the girl's toothpaste to write a simple message. The Nor was here. I don't think I need to explain how terrifying that was. They spent about half an hour cleaning up the cabin before the girls could return. The girls were upset to find their belongings destroyed, but were told a raccoon got inside. As far as they knew, it was just a bad stroke of luck. The night passed, and the campers left the next day with no more incidents. Mom's 2 weeks were up, and she went home. She's still in close contact with a lot of her fellow counselors from that time, and they confirmed the Nor did not return after that. Final notes. This ends the chronicle of the Nerd on the Roof. However, there are some final points worth noting that don't fit in the above parts. Specifically, there's a strong chance that the Nerd on the Roof and the man who vandalized Cabin E are different people. The camp had a nice couple living there as caretakers, along with an adult son who was not so nice. He always gave off creepy vibes. Mom and the other counselors now suspect that he overheard them talking about the Nor at some point, since they talked about him a lot, and used it as inspiration to break into the cabin as some sort of a sick joke. However, since he lived on the campgrounds, it made no sense for him to be the one who jumped off the roof and run to a getaway car that gunned towards town. One theory I have is this. The original Nerd on the Roof was the attempted kidnapper, scouting the camps in advance. The fact that Cabin D is at the bottom of the hill with the 3 occupied cabins that week makes this seem even more likely. When he realized he'd been spotted, he ran off to where his partner was waiting to drive away. If true, it just adds an extra layer to how premeditated the attempted kidnapping was. But after having my mom retell the story to write this up, I realized something which is even more disturbing. As mentioned earlier, my mother's memory of the exact timeline is a bit spotty. We placed the phone line incident on Friday because she remembers the counselors were on edge after the Nor sighting, but they hadn't seen the headline about the attempted kidnapping. Since it's been over 40 years, she doesn't remember exactly which day the attempted kidnapping at the neighboring camp occurred, only that it wasn't the same day as the Nor incident. In other words, there's a chance the kidnapping attempt happened on Friday night. And the other camp is in the same direction as Cabin E. I don't think I need to say more. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories. episode 379. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Well, that final story was equal parts delightful and horrifying. Delightful because horrifying for obvious reasons, but delightful because I love the Friday the 13th movies, and, you set things at a summer camp, you can't help but think of it. Really hope they make another one of those soon, but there are some rights issues they need to work out, and quite frankly, if they don't work them out, no one benefits from it, so hopefully they'll put their heads together and work out a deal that everyone can benefit from, because in the end, if they ain't making movies because they're too busy arguing about who has the right to make movies, nobody's making money, and ultimately we the fans are losing out. That being said, if you want to watch a pretty good Friday the 13th film that you've probably never seen before, I suggest you check out the very excellent professionally made fan film Never Hike Alone. Well made, a little bit of a surprise, at the end for those of you who've seen the previous films. And that's all I'm going to say on that. Okay, so with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.